two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth, then took the other as just as fair.
Robert Frost is perhaps the preeminent and certainly one of the most consequential of our American poets in the 20th century. He was principally known as a New Englander because that's where he principally lived, often in Vermont, where he's buried, in New Hampshire, importantly also. But he was a poet who probably set the national standard for what it meant to deal in the plain American style. Poets knew him first as a important practitioner. He had a lot of trouble making a living early on, and we can talk about that in a bit. But by the end of his life, at his death, he was very close to the apotheosis of a national spokesperson, and almost everybody alive in America saw him at John F. Kennedy's inaugural in the year 1961, in January 61, when he stood up at the podium and famously read or recited the gift outright.
Is about the new order of the ages.
So by that time, he was unquestionably the most important American poet, but it had been a long, slow, steady rise. Probably his principal also ran or contender was T.S. Eliot, who moved the other way and spent his life, his large, late life in England. So Frost is the quintessential American figure, and he represents in a certain sense what Emily Dickinson did a century before, the private New Englander breaking new ground. He was always engaged in the formalities of verse, and he was quite rigorous about them. But he managed to sound homespun, and as if the language were not something that came to you from an Olympian height and required a dictionary. Frost was a plain-spoken person, both in life and in his art. Frost was, as I said, celebrated as and known almost entirely as a New England poet. He did, in fact, spend some time in England. He spent some time in Florida. But the vast majority of his life was in Vermont and New Hampshire, Massachusetts also. Nonetheless, he knew someone in Ann Arbor and came at the invitation of the then president. Marion Burton invited him in 1921 to be a kind of writer in residence. Now you can't throw a stone at a university without uncovering a writer in residence or three, an artist in residence. But at that time, which is after all almost a century ago, it was close to a revolutionary notion. Artists were kept at a very stiff arm's remove from academe, and and Frost was not a scholar nor a university graduate himself. He ended up receiving all sorts of honorary degrees, and he became often a doctor of humane letters. But at the time, he was somebody who was more known as a farmer and a private citizen. So for a university to invite him and say, "You're a person of consequence, why don't you hang around," was already rather remarkable. He came in 1921. He stayed for a year. He went back to Vermont, and then he returned again for a couple of years, 1923 and 24. So though his tenure here was relatively brief, it was nonetheless during an important period of his creative life, and indeed some of the poems that we think of as about New England were composed here, perhaps out of a sense of sorrow at distance, perhaps out of a sense of nostalgia at absence, but nonetheless Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour, then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down to day, nothing gold can stay. His work became more and more consequential during the course of his life, as I've already suggested, and he was considered by many to be a sort of, folksy poet and a local spokesperson and hero, one of those Farmer's Almanac types who said wise things about fences and birch trees. One of his early biographers, a man called Lawrence Thompson, uncovered, it wasn't that hard to do, some of the less than splendid aspects of Frost's personal and public life. And at a certain point, people began to confuse or conflate the difficulties that he had, the madness that ran in his family, with the light-hearted seeming surface of his poems. And his reputation took a bit of a nosedive. I think by now that has reversed again, and he is understood to be a poet of great depth and complexity. Without overstating the case for Ann Arbor or making it crucial as a locus for his work, it's important to remember that this poet, who seems so rooted in a particular place, also was elsewhere. And the fact that his work has crossed not merely county and state, but national boundaries, has something to do with his willingness to be transplanted. He was rootless as well as rooted, and the poetry thrives on those tensions. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice.